Good afternoon. It's good to see everybody here. Our first speaker is going to be Dr. Russell Hawkins, Islam and Larson, presenting out of the University of Florida, Gainesville. They're going to be talking about the living pump, history of parental cross-circulation as a precursor to pediatric cardiopulmonary bypass and extracorporeal membrane oxygenation.
Good afternoon. Thank you all very much for the opportunity to present. I have nothing to disclose. The development of cardiopulmonary bypass has a long history, and it was very difficult. The first proposal in theory of extracorporeal oxygenation was back in 1813, when a French physiologist, Le Galois, proposed the idea, but it took a long time for the technology to catch up. A key development was in 1916 when McLean, who was then a medical student, actually discovered and isolated heparin from canine liver cells. And then in 1934, John Gibbon, when he was a surgical resident, started building prototype heart-lung bypass machines after he saw a patient die of a massive pulmonary embolism and wondered what could he do differently. He interestingly had very little support for this and was doing it in his basement with his wife. It wasn't until 1955 when there were successful modifications of the Gibbon and eventually DeWall bubble oxygenators that made cardiopulmonary bypass possible. Prior to that time in the 1950s, congenital heart defects were devastating conditions with very few options for repair and extremely high mortality. And the early efforts of repairing these were really limited by the quality of the materials, especially oxygenation and tubing and pumps. The focus of this talk is on Dr. Walton Lillehei at the University of Minnesota. Given the difficulties with the membrane and pump materials, he looked at the problem differently. He proposed using a living pump, controlled cross-circulation by cannulation of the patient's parent on an adjacent operating table. And he actually worked on this in the canine laboratory at University of Minnesota for at least 2 years to develop and perfect the technique, and got approval from his chief to go ahead and try it on some human patients. Sorry, is that not advancing? Let me try that. There we go. Thank you. The schematic here on the left is adapted from a publication about the technique. And on the right, you can see the parent. On the left, you can see the child. The parent's femoral artery was cannulated, and arterialized oxygenated blood flowed through the tubing into this manually controlled finger pump, and then directly into the child's aorta and systemic circulation. The deoxygenated blood came from the child's cava, back through the finger pump, and back into the parent's femoral vein. And on the right is a picture of the first time this was done for a human in 1954, where over on screen right, you can see the parent's groin is cannulated, and in the middle, on the left side of the screen, you can see Dr. Lillehei repairing the ventricular septal defect of an 11-month-old with his team. Dr. Lillehei and his team operated on 45 child-parent dyads across 1 year in 1954 to 1955. And as I mentioned, they used that finger pump to circulate the parent's blood into the child's aorta. Of course, the parent had to be a blood match donor. They used normothermia during these cases, and they did about 1/3 normal flow rate for the child. Dr. Lillehei actually followed all his patients for a 30-year follow-up that he published in 1985. And overall had 62% in-hospital survival for the cases he did. He had one donor complication. There was one parent who unfortunately had an air embolism due to a tubing malfunction and had a permanent neurologic injury. He operated on 27 ventricular septal defect patients, 5 complete AV canal defects, and remarkably 10 tetralogy of Fallot patients, who prior to that time could only be palliated with shunt. Over the same time period between 1953 and 1955, John Gibbon was developing his bypass machine. He eventually used it on 5 human patients between those 2 years. 4 of those 5 patients died. Gibbon became very discouraged by the use of the machine and actually went around the country during these 2 years telling people don't use it. He had patented the product with IBM, but interestingly was not interested in royalties. He actually freely gave the plans to anyone in the country who wanted to use them, including Kirkland down at Mayo. Kirkland modified that Gibbon oxygenator, and then DeWall came to join Lillehei at University of Minnesota, and they developed the DeWall bubble oxygenator. That became the standard of care in 1955. And because there was now a valid mechanical alternative, he stopped using the cross-circulation technique to avoid any risk of a parental donor. Dr. Cooley, at a dinner honoring Dr. Lillehei in 1988, said, "Walt, you provided the can opener for the biggest picnic that cardiac surgeons have ever known." This had a huge lasting impact. Parental cross-circulation demonstrated the feasibility of cardiopulmonary bypass for repair of these deadly defects. And the bold innovation of the surgical team really paved the way for the development of cardiac surgery and ECMO as we know it. And to me, really highlights the history of innovation within the field of pediatric surgery. And one big takeaway for me was the sacrifice and courage of the parents who were willing to act as circulation donors to their children with a completely experimental technique. Thank you all very much. I'd be happy to take any questions.
This paper. This paper. This paper. Paper's open for any questions. So, so how did you develop the interest to go through this kind of historical, career of kind of this amazing development?
I was in the lab with Dr. Larson, and he told me that when he was in the lab at UTMB, he used to try to dig up the old art index papers about stuff. So I found Dr. Bartlett's original paper for ECMO, and in that paper he referenced cross-circulation. I go, what is that? Never heard of it. So then I went down this rabbit hole and discovered all this stuff, and I thought it was super interesting. Yeah.
Great. Any other comments or questions?
I just wanted to make a comment over here. If you haven't read it, there's a wonderful book about this called King of Hearts.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Yeah, I heard about that from Dr. Islam. Thank you. I haven't read it yet.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you all very much.